Now it's time to connect everything together that I've already went over in this video. So it's time, I'm going to connect all that together because separately, many of these scriptures might not seem to have anything to do with each other separately. So, I'm going to go over, before I get started and really get deep into this, I'm going to go over some very important scripture. I'm going to read Isaiah 28:10. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. I know I already mentioned that in this video, but I do want to reinforce that because that right there tells us that, and I'm reminding you again, because that right there tells us that certain parts of scriptures, pieces of scripture, of the puzzle if you will, can be scattered throughout the Bible. For instance, end-time prophecies. We see end-time prophecies scattered throughout, let's see, what is it, Daniel, the book of Daniel. Is it in, still was a prophecy in Ezekiel? I have to double check that. Matthew 24, and the corresponding Gospels. I think there's a little bit mentioned in Thessalonians or something. Most definitely Revelations. So, that right there, you put together end-time prophecies. Well, the same thing is true about, say, the biblical day. And the biblical day is directly associated with God's timeline and God's calendar. Okay, so if we're going to go by if we're going to interpret prophecy, then we have to do it the biblical way. We have to interpret it to the way God sees a day. So, let's take a look at some more scripture. Let's see. I'm going to have to come back to that later. So, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, 8, 13, 19, 23, and 31, each one of them ends with evening and morning. Okay? Evening and morning was the first day, evening and morning was the second day, and so on. And then, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Thus, the heavens and the earth, all the host of them were finished. And all the hosts of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work, which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had rested. He rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Verse 3, Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. This right here is also why we have a 6-day work week and we rest on the Sabbath day. This right here is one of the main scripture. Okay? So, okay, so that verse of scripture right there And scripture about the Sabbath day, like the 6-day work week, and then the 7th day of rest, has been connected to Matthew chapter 90 verse 4 and 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8. I'll read them real quick. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, and like a watch in the night. Okay, that was Psalms 90 verse 4. 2 Peter 3 and 8. But beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as 1 day. So, because of that verse has been connected to the 6-day work week and the 7th day of rest, and it has been presumed that the 7 days, that this right here means that we have a 7,000 year timeline, or that God has a 7,000 year timeline. See, the 6 days, it has been interpreted as a 7,000 year timeline. Okay, because the 6 days of rest, and then the 7th day, the Sabbath. That in the 7th day, that would mean that Jesus would come back on the 7th day, on the biblical 7th day, or the 7th millennium. Now, I'm going to explain my issue with that. Here's my problem with that, and why that does not make sense anymore. Okay? Especially for the past, 30 years. Definitely 23 years, it does not make sense. And I'm going to explain why. You see, okay, as of the time this video is being recorded, it is October 14th, 2023. Last month, the Hebrew calendar turned to a 5783. Well, that's what it said. Now, the Hebrew calendar is said to be missing 240 years. If that's the case, that would put the true Hebrew year, the actual Hebrew year, at 6,023. That would put us on the 7th millennium. Okay? That puts us in the 7th millennium already. And according to the 7,000 year timeline, Jesus should have came back 23 years ago. The second coming should have took place 23 years ago. So, here's where the misinterpretation comes in at. The 7-day timeline has been slightly misinterpreted because of our understanding, because of the Gregorian calendar definition of a day. Okay, like the way we go by a day, the way we define a day, instead of the biblical definition of a day. The way we define a day, a new day to us begins at midnight. Okay? Midnight. Okay, so midnight is the beginning of a new day to us. Okay, because we go by midnight to midnight calendar, like days. Okay? So yeah, so when the clock strikes midnight, it's a new day. And on God's timeline, midnight is the new millennium. Okay? Midnight is the new millennium. And going by the missing 240 years on the Hebrew calendar, which puts it at, which means that the Hebrew calendar is supposed to say 6023 instead of 5783. That would mean that we are on the seventh day, the seventh millennium on God's timeline. And we have been on the seventh millennium, or the seventh day in God's timeline, for the past 23 years, ever since the fall of 1999, when the Hebrew calendar said 5760, when it should have said 6000 even, on the Hebrew New Year. Or, I guess, what they would call Rosh Hashanah or something like that. So, yeah, that right there, on the Rosh Hashanah of 1999, it was 6,000. The Hebrew calendar just said 5760, but it should have said 6,000. That was the beginning of the seventh millennium, and that's why I believe that. That's why I say that Jesus should have came back 23 years ago if we're going to go by the 7,000 year timeline. But then, and that's also why I went over the biblical definition of a day, the 4 types of days. Okay, and I'm going to recap them again, because I've already mentioned them a few times in this video already. The first type is a 24-hour day, a 24-hour period. The second type, day as opposed to night, like daytime. Third type, evening and morning. And by the way, the evening and morning, we see that in throughout Genesis chapter 1. The first 2 types, you can also see that in the definition of the Hebrew word for day. The Hebrew word for day can also refer to an unspecified amount of time, but I'm not focusing on that. Like, it can refer to like a season or an age or something, but it can also refer to days. Okay, and no, I do not believe in day-age creationism. I do not have time to get into that right now. Evening and morning, and also debunks day-age, but that's a different video. I personally believe in the gap theory, okay? But that is a different video. Like I said, that is a different video. Okay, so, let's see, what was I saying? Yes, eating morning, and then the fourth type of day, which we see in Psalm 90 verse 4, and 2 Peter 3:8, is 1,000-year day. So, let's look at God's timeline. Do this way. So, if one day equates to 1,000 years to God, and if 1,000 years equates to a day to God, and a day is a 24-hour period, then you take 1,000, get out a calculator. I'm with the calculator on my phone. You take 1,000 and divide that by 24. And you get 41 2/3. Or 41 dot and a long line of 6s. So 41 2/3. Okay? Now, earlier in this video, I pointed out how, biblically speaking, 6 a.m., the biblical daytime begins at 6 a.m., the biblical 24-hour day begins at 6 p.m. Okay? God goes by evening and morning days, we see that in Genesis, so which on God's timeline equates to 12 hours. Okay? Now then, so, since we know that 6 a.m. is the biblical first hour of the daytime. And 6 a.m. is also 6 hours after midnight. We can multiply the 41 2/3 by 6 and arrive at 250. Okay? Of course, you can also do it this way. You can take 24 divided by 4 and get 6. 1000 divided by 4 and get 250. So you would still get 250 because, again, 6 hours equates to 250 years to God. According to this right here. Then you double that. Well, that also means that 12 hours is 500 years to God. Or, 500 years equals 12 hours. 250 years is 6 hours. Okay? So on God's timeline, this is where I'm going to start saying controversial stuff. 6 a.m. on God's timeline is 250 years after midnight, which is the new millennium. So if you see like a calculator, so you take 1000, divide that by 24, you get 41 2/3. Multiply that by 6, you get 250. Add 1999 to it, and you get 2249. Okay? $22.49. Okay? Which, again, since the Hebrew calendar is missing 240 years, and it's supposed to be 6,023 right now, so you take 5783, that's what the Hebrew calendar currently says. The Hebrew calendar is said to be missing 240 years, so you add the 240 years to that, and that brings you up to 6,023. 6,023, which is the actual Hebrew year, which that's what the Hebrew calendar should actually say instead of 5783. Okay? Now then, let's see, how should I do this? Okay, now then, since we know that 6 hours is 250 years after the 7th millennium, the 7th millennium being 6,000, we take 1,000 times 6 plus 250. Okay, and you get 6,250. In the year that Jesus comes back, the Hebrew calendar should say 6,250. Okay, but it's actually going to say 6,010. So in the year that Jesus comes back, the Hebrew calendar should say 6,250. But it's actually going to say 6,010. Okay? So, if you subtract 6,023 from 6,250, you would get 227. That is how long we have until Jesus comes back. 227 years. And I just showed you biblical proof. So now we add this year to 227. So we add 2022. That takes us to 2249. So when the year that Jesus comes back, the Gregorian calendar would say 2249. Okay? So, yeah, and again, I just gave biblical proof in these last couple of videos. Okay? I just showed video of biblical proof, and in the next clip, in the next video, in part 3, the final part, I originally intended it to be a 3-part video, but it turned out that this turned out to be like an hour and a half worth of content in full, so it ended up becoming a 3-part video. Okay, because I don't want to try uploading any videos longer than 30 minutes, or much longer than 30 minutes. Okay, so this is about an hour and a half worth of content. So, part 3. Okay? I'm going to go into more detail in part 3, and I'm going to provide even more biblical proof.